Hi, Chuck Bennett here. My presentation is on quality of educational opportunity. This was not a piece of legislation. It was actually a report that was required by a piece of legislation. And um, until I did this research, I did not realize just how important this report was. It's truly a watershed event. The way that we think about educational research before the Coleman Report, to the extent that we thought of it at all, is completely different than the way we think of it today. And it's because of the Coleman Report. Some of the findings of the Coleman Report still are echoing down 50 years later. In order to understand the Coleman Report, we need to go back in history a little bit just to understand the context. I'm sure you recall from school the Jim Crow days. This was Jim Crow laws were in the American South, and there were basically a set of laws for white folks and another set of laws for black folks. And this system was legitimized by the Supreme Court. They said, you know what, separate but equal, that's okay. And it became the law of the land. And so in the South, it made it routine. Railroad cars, you'd have a car for white folks, you'd have another car for black folks. You'd have water fountains for white folks, and for colored folks you'd have separate entrances to movie theaters. If a business owner said, hey, we'll serve these people but we don't want to serve those people, well, under separate but equal, it was legal. For us educators, of course, we know that in the South, that meant that there were black schools and there were white schools. And this is the way it was done in the South until finally 1954. 1954 brought another watershed event, the Brown versus Board of Education decision. The Warren Supreme Court decided unanimously that having white schools and black schools was unconstitutional, and they required Southern schools to integrate. Now, some schools were already integrated, and in some places this went just fine. This picture comes from a school in Washington, D.C. But there was a lot of resistance in the South. This is Alabama Governor George Wallace. He is they're holding off federal marshals. He is refusing to allow 4 black students from enrolling into the University of Alabama. He famously said, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And of course we know the story of Ruby Bridges. Here she is coming down the steps from her first day in elementary school in New Orleans. So school is a battleground, and for the Civil Rights Movement. In 1964, another big event, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it was signed into law by Lyndon Johnson. Johnson was a Texas politician, and he was a Southern Democrat, but he believed strongly in the Civil Rights Act and used all of his political will to push this through. Here he is talking to, this is actually Richard Russell. He is a Georgia senator. He was one of the conservative Democrats who were filibustering the Civil Rights Act. Now, Johnson and the people who wrote the Civil Rights Act, they actually wrote into the language a requirement that a report be produced. They wanted to have some data, something that they could show southern states and say, hey, what you're doing is wrong, discriminating against these black kids is hurting them, and you need to stop. So as a consequence, in 1966, the report was produced, and we know it as the Coleman Report. It's called the Coleman Report because of this man. This is James S. Coleman, and he faced a daunting task because at the time, actually very little was known about American schools. There was no for example, repository of data about standardized testing that he could access and analyze, because there were no standardized tests that were given across the country. So he and his team had to start at ground zero. Now, the way that people thought about how to determine the quality of a school back then was different than it is. They would look at the inputs of the school. How much money did the school get? How many resources? How many students were in the classroom? What type of training did the teachers have? How many books were in the library? How many labs were in the science labs did a school have? How many microscopes were in there? Those sort of quantifiable inputs, that's how people decided whether or not a school was good. But Coleman, he was interested in the outcomes. He said, if you want to know the quality of the school, we need to know things like, how are the students doing? What kind of achievement do they have? What's their likelihood to graduate? What's the impact on adult life? Those are the questions we continue to ask, and the questions that we ask in order to determine how good a school is. And this comes to us from the Coleman Report. So Coleman and his team, they created all these different surveys and sent them out. They ended up going to 4,000 different schools, 5,000 teachers, about 1,000 principals, and 600,000 students. Now, this was in the mid 1960s. There were not a lot of computers back then, and the ones they had were not very powerful, and they were huge and bulky. And there was no system for him to gather this information. So again, they were starting at ground zero. Actually, they used the Educational Testing Service out of Princeton, New Jersey. You recognize them from the SAT. Well, he used them to send out the surveys, and he used their mainframe computers in order to analyze. And the result was an enormous amount of information. And by the time that he was said and done in 1966, and when they finally issued the report to the president and to the Congress, they ended up with 737 pages. In fact, it was so big, it really took a while to digest what the report was saying. A man who went on to become senator, his name was Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He was a professor at Harvard, and he put together a weekly seminar that lasted an entire year, and the subject of the seminar was nothing but this report. 50 years later, in fact last year, they had the 50th anniversary of this report, and they had symposiums, and educational magazines were devoting entire issues just to this report. 50 years later, it's still being cited on an average of 600 times a year. That's how important the Coleman Report was. So what does it say? Well, one of the conclusions was, yes, there is segregation. Schools are segregated. And that wasn't a big surprise. 65% of African American students they found went to schools that were predominantly African American, and 80% of white children attended schools that were 90 to 100% white. And this was expected. But the Coleman Report, the reason it's remembered, it came up with some conclusions that were not expected. Remember that Johnson and the people who wrote the Civil Rights Act, they wanted a report that would justify their own assumptions about what was going on. And Coleman found that things were not what everyone thought they were. One concept that he pioneered was that of the achievement gap. And of course, I don't think this was a big surprise back then, but a typical African American 12th grader in the South performed at about the same level as a white 7th grader in the Northeast. So he showed that there was achievement gap within between the races, but also within the between regions in the country. one thing that's interesting from looking at his research, he found that what he called Oriental Americans, today we call them Asian Americans, performed higher than whites, and then the whites performed higher than the blacks. And this is, very similar to what we continue to see. The biggest impact on achievement. This was something that got a lot of people's attention. According to his analysis, the biggest impact on student learning was the family background. In other words, the socioeconomic status. Not necessarily race, not school, certainly. It was the socioeconomic status of the child. And all the things that went into that, that's what had the biggest impact on achievement. There was a paragraph buried in the report, and it's the paragraph most often cited when you talk about the Coleman Report, and it has a bombshell in it. For most minority groups then, and most particularly the Negro schools, provided little opportunity for them to overcome this initial deficiency. In fact, they fall farther behind the white majority in the development of several skills which are critical to making a living and participating fully in modern society. Whatever may be the combination of non-school factors, poverty, community attitudes, low educational level of the parents, remember, this is that's what he says causes the biggest impact, which put minority children at a disadvantage in verbal and nonverbal skills when they enter the first grade. The fact is, the schools have not overcome it. In other words, his research was showing that schools don't matter. They appear to have no impact on a student's learning. Teachers, they matter a little bit, he said. And they matter a little more for minority students, and the further a child went in his educational career, they would matter a little more as time went on. But even then, not that much. And he also found that more money doesn't help. That schools that get a lot of money, there's not a correlation with higher achievement. These were bombshells. But here was another one. It said a student's classmate's socioeconomic status has a large effect on his or her achievement. Now, let me be more specific, and I'll just quote the Coleman Report. If a minority pupil from a home without much educational strength is put with schoolmates with strong educational backgrounds, his achievement is likely to increase. So if you put a child from a disadvantaged background in with students that do have a good background, they're going to do better. But the reverse is not the case. So in other words, if a white pupil from a home that is strongly and effectively supportive of education is put in a school where most pupils do not come from such homes, his achievement will be little different than if he were in a home composed of others like himself. So he is saying that if you take a child from a good background and put him into a bad school, it's not really going to affect him. So what we have here is an early example of how policymakers took educational research and used it to apply to the policy they developed. This is what led to forced school busing. You'll remember that the Supreme Court decision of 1954 said that schools had to integrate, and a lot of schools in the years since were not integrating. And so federal courts began to order, okay, then you need to bus kids across your across school district lines to integrate the schools if you can't do it any other way. Now, this was controversial, but in some places it worked well. In Charlotte-Mecklenburg, for example, the school district there found success with forced busing. They were able to successfully and peacefully integrate their schools. But in other parts of the country, and particularly in urban centers in the north, places like Boston and Detroit, there were a lot of protests and a lot of resentment against forced busing. Now, the fact is, forced busing did serve to integrate schools, however, but what happened in the 90s, public opinion began to turn against busing, and courts began to rule against it, and so there's very little in the way of busing these days. So what's the long-term impact of the Coleman Report? Well, it's certainly not the last word. It continues to be cited, but it's not the last word. Clearly, there's been a lot of research since then. There were, in going back through the results, people have uncovered flaws in their analysis, flaws in some of their data collection, and in the years since, there have been vast amounts and types of research and data that are now available to us. There are a lot stronger analytical tools, and obviously a lot more computing power is available to researchers these days. But the Coleman Report, it marked out the playing field. It shifted the way that schools are thought of, and the way that education is thought of, the types of questions that we ask, how we answer those questions. It brought a mathematical rigor and a scientific basis to understanding educational research. It was very controversial, and as a result, it attracted a lot of talent to educational research, and that we're still living in that world where educational research is highly valued. And also, it established a precedent that public policy needs to be guided by scientific, mathematically rigorous research. Now, current research shows that Coleman's study underestimated the impact of schools and teachers, and it also shows that the amount of money spent on education, well, the amount doesn't matter as much as how that money is spent. So Betsy DeVos just last month was in front of Congress saying the amount of money you spend on schools doesn't matter. Well, that comes from the Coleman Report. But research since shows that that's a little simplistic way of understanding funding. In the Coleman Report, it shows how far that we have come in the past 50 years. But it also how far we have to go. Segregation back in 1965. You recall 65% African American students attended schools that were 90 to 100% African American. And 80% of white children attended schools that were predominantly white. 2016, the percentage of segregated non-white schools has risen. It had gotten as low as 5.7% in the 1980s, and this, of course, was thanks to busing, but by last year it was back up to 18.6%. Now, this isn't legal segregation. In other words, we're not saying, okay, this type of kid is going to go to this school, this type to that school. It's by virtue of where people live. And we know within our own district, we have some schools. I've cited Lyman Hall before as a school that is 99% Hispanic and 100% free and reduced lunch. That wasn't by rule, but circumstances certainly created segregated schools in Hall County. An achievement gap. You recall in 1965, African American 12th grader in the South, about the same level of achievement as a white 7th grader in the Northeast. And if we look currently, typical African American 12th grader is performing at a 19th percentile of white students. This achievement gap is stubborn, and it is very consistent. It has not changed substantially from 50 years ago. We see the same pattern. Asian American, that subgroup performs better than whites, and whites perform better than African Americans, and also now that we have substantial numbers of Hispanic students, we're seeing that gap as well. And it's fluctuated a little bit in the last 50 years, but not significantly. So the Coleman Report has told us or shown us the way in terms of how to conduct research and the types of questions to ask. but clearly we have not come up with all the answers. So maybe in another 50 years, when they have the 100th anniversary of the Coleman Report, somebody will have figured this out. Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed the presentation and hope you enjoy the rest of the summer. See you. Bye.